Well, the story really starts here in that I was doing research on the woman who wrote this book, which is the first guidebook to Canterbury stained glass. And very fortunately, all of her papers were preserved after her death. And I was working through all of this correspondence and the documents and discovered that among these papers were the actual notebooks that she used or that she made as she went through the cathedral with the glazier, Samuel Caldwell Sr., and she took notes on what he was telling her in terms of the content of the glass. And I found with this schematic that on this panel, which we had queried as possibly being medieval, she had in fact written old and horse on it. And so what that means is that the glazier told her it's an old panel. And this is the same man who supposedly made that panel. So that certainly got the suspicion going that perhaps what we had here really was an old panel, a medieval panel, and not something that had been made up by a restorer. After I found Emily Williams' notebook, in which she had indicated that the panel was old, it occurred to me that there were photos that were early, and I looked at this photo, which dates from 1861, and I'd actually looked at this many times before, but now I looked to see if that panel was indeed in the photograph, and sure enough, there it is. You can actually see the horse on that panel. So this image dates to 1861, which is decades then before this panel was supposedly made. So again, this made us think, boy, this really could be a medieval panel and not one that was made by a restorer in the late 19th century.
She started coming to me, asking me questions about the windows. And some of them I realized I couldn't answer because we were working from photographs, and you can't really answer all questions just from photographs. But I also realized that the questions she was asking were important ones.
So once Leonie was convinced that it really was worthwhile for us to have a close look at this glass, she put in an application to get permission to remove the panels from the window. And the Friends of Canterbury Cathedral very generously funded the entire project. So in July of this past year, scaffolding went up and all of the figural panels came out and were brought to the studio. And so you can see the panel with the pilgrims there right in the center. So once we had the panel in the studio, what we did was to examine every single piece of glass within it. So stained glass is a mosaic art, and what you have are small pieces of glass all held together by lead. So Leonie went through every single piece of glass in the panel, and there are over 250 pieces of glass within this one panel, to determine whether it was a medieval piece or a modern piece.
The image on the left here shows our original, quite skeptical assessment of what might be medieval glass, and we thought perhaps 40%. But the reality is much better. We have probably over 70% of the original image left. And this now allows us to produce standard charts for art historians to consult in the future, and those will be published. And this is pretty close to what the window would have looked like when it was brand new.
One of the most exciting things that we were able to see once we had the glass in the studio was the fact that the original inscription of this panel is still there. So when you look at this panel in the window, it just looks as if the pilgrims are traveling along a white road. But if you get it into the studio and put raking light on it, so light that's coming at it at an angle, what you can see are the remains of letters still on the glass. And I remember that moment. I think we actually started dancing around the studio. We were so happy to find this. And this section of the inscriptions has the letters R-I-N. And when we looked at the entire inscription, we were able to find the letters that spell out Peregrini Sancti, which means pilgrims of the saint.
Well, the most exciting discovery is to find a medieval scene that we didn't know we had, and one of such importance. and of such beauty. It's really surprising how elegant, how complex, how interested in social interaction. It is full of information about life in the Middle Ages and what pilgrims really experienced when they were on the road. There are many things that we're learning from this. First of all, it's the first time that we really have a very accurate picture of what is medieval, what's original, what's later, how the changes have occurred. And we now also know how to date it much better, because we can compare it to other existing glass in Canterbury Cathedral where we know the date, and we now reliably know what to compare it with. Another really interesting outcome is that throughout the whole window we've begun to understand how close the text sources were expressed in the imagery. So there is a really, really close collaboration between the people who wrote the miracles and the people who designed the windows. And that's really exciting.